Hello everyone and welcome to our dive into Limbo. I'm Justin Gora, the founder and lead dev of Behodler, of the Behodler ecosystem, and of Limbo in particular. The reason that this video and subsequent videos have been made is to take a dive into Limbo, to understand it from a high-level overview, and then to slowly get an introduction into the code base. The initial purpose for making this video was to assist the audit process of Limbo for the upcoming audit. But if you want to get stuck into the ecosystem as a developer, or if you just want to understand things a little bit better, then this video will prove quite helpful. Quite often when you're going through the code, things become a little confusing if you lose sight of why certain design decisions and philosophies were made and taken. So it sometimes helps to come back to the beginning of this video, to the high level overview, and then to give yourself a refresher for the constraints that Limbo and Behodler face, and then when you jump back into the code, it makes things a little bit easier to slot into place. So a lot of the good Ethereum projects tend to keep a common theme running throughout their code base. The DAI code base is the best example of this. They have metaphors that extend throughout their code as a constant reminder of what the code is doing and what it's about. I think Aave has a pretty good version of this as well. So in the case of Limbo, I would, as I said, I would recommend just returning to these high-level concepts. It'll just help things settle in a bit. So before I ramble on too much about that, let's talk about Limbo. So although this video is aimed primarily at understanding Limbo, you can't understand Limbo in isolation. It belongs to an ecosystem and it only makes sense in the context of Behodler. So before getting into the nitty-gritty of Limbo, we just need to get a bit of a background understanding of why Limbo exists and what's going on, and to do that we need to understand the Behodler AMM in particular. So let's go to the next slide. This is an overview of the ecosystem, but for those of you who are old hats in this community, you'll notice that there are quite a few pieces missing, in particular the governance token I. So this overview is kind of a set of relationships that has a particular importance to Limbo. So at the center of everything is the Behodler AMM, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And adjacent to that and dependent on that is the Limbo Dapp. And from a very simplistic point of view, Limbo is a yield farming or a liquidity mining dApp for the Behodler AMM. But in a number of nuanced ways, it's quite different from traditional liquidity mining dApps, and in fact it shares a lot more with the crowdfunding space than with the liquidity mining. So it's probably more accurate to think of Limbo as a crowdfunding dApp with liquidity mining or yield farm incentives and user experience to make it appropriate for DeFi. So the question is why? Why do we have a crowdfunding dApp that accompanies a AMM? And to understand that, you need to understand the constraints that face the Behodler AMM. So if you're familiar with DeFi, which you probably are if you're listening to this video, then you probably find the concept of token pair based AMMs quite comfortable by now, with Uniswap and SushiSwap and all of the Uniswap forks. It's become quite a dominant paradigm to have an AMM that's composed of thousands of contracts that themselves each contain only 2 tokens worth of liquidity. So there are alternatives to the Uniswap model, such as Balancer, but Balancer is pretty much the same concept of Uniswap, where n equals 8 instead of 2, but it's still essentially a small batch of tokens lumped together in a smart contract. And Curve has its own thing going, but generally throughout DeFi, what you'll find in an AMM is that liquidity is grouped and segregated from each other within the barriers and confines of smart contracts, and then various routing strategies, whether on the front end or on smart contracts, web those all together to create a coherent AMM experience, so that you don't have to figure out which pair routes to which to make a swap in Uniswap. Uniswap will do that for you, so that you can just get the one-to-one experience. Behodler simplifies things in the sense that all liquidity and all tokens are stored on a single central contract, the Behodler AMM contract. So Behodler could potentially have thousands of tokens listed, and all of that liquidity would reside in the single contract. What this means, well, it means a number of things. One of them is that there's no routing strategies. But it also has very strong implications for the relationship between the tokens within Behodler, and the security implications and the gas implications. And then when we zoom out to the liquidity token, there's crypto economic implications there. So it's quite a lot to unpack how the design of Behodler impacts the rest of the Behodler ecosystem and how it differs from others. And we won't go into that into too much detail, because we need to stick to what is important with regards to Limbo.